Arizona Territory, 1883. The shovel struck hard earth one final time as Reverend Samuel Morrison wiped sweat from his brow, staring down at the crude wooden box that held what the town believed to be Rebecca Hayes, a young woman condemned for the unforgivable sin of loving an Apache warrior. But 6 feet below, Rebecca's heart still beat against her ribs like a caged bird, her fingernails already torn and bleeding from clawing at the coffin lid above her head. What the good people of Millfield didn't know was that somewhere in the darkness beyond their settlement, a massive St. Bernard named Thunder had caught a scent that would drive him to dig through rock and soil until his paws bled. And racing behind him through the moonlit desert was Joseph Crow Feather, a man torn between 2 worlds, carrying rope, tools, and a desperate prayer that he wasn't already too late. Sometimes love demands the ultimate sacrifice, but sometimes, when hope seems buried deeper than the grave itself, the most unlikely saviors emerge from the shadows to prove that some bonds are stronger than death, deeper than hatred, and more powerful than the rigid rules that small minds use to destroy what they cannot understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millfield's dusty main street as Rebecca Hayes adjusted the heavy water buckets that cut into her shoulders, each step toward the Apache reservation deliberate and measured. At 19, she possessed the kind of practical beauty that her father's congregation appreciated in a preacher's daughter. Auburn hair always neatly braided, green eyes that reflected both intelligence and compassion, and the steady composure that came from years of helping her father minister to a frontier community where survival often required as much faith as it did fortitude. But today, like every Tuesday and Friday for the past 8 months, Rebecca carried more than water to the reservation. Hidden beneath the false bottom of her larger bucket were medical supplies, carefully stolen from her father's church dispensary, and a letter written in the careful script she had been teaching herself in Apache, words of love and longing addressed to a man whose very existence challenged everything her community believed about civilization, savagery, and the unbridgeable divide between white and native worlds. The reservation sat 3 miles east of Millfield, a collection of government-issued canvas tents and hastily constructed adobe buildings that housed nearly 200 Apache men, women, and children who had been forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in the Chiricahua Mountains. The federal Indian agent, a corrupt bureaucrat named Harrison Caldwell, had been systematically reducing their food rations while selling the surplus supplies to local ranchers for personal profit, a practice that Rebecca had discovered quite by accident 6 months earlier when she'd volunteered to help distribute government aid. That discovery had led to her first real conversation with Joseph Crow Feather, a 26-year-old Apache man whose English education at a government boarding school had given him the linguistic tools to document Caldwell's theft, but whose tribal status provided no legal standing to challenge the agent's authority. Joseph's father had been a respected war chief before the surrender, and his mother came from a line of traditional healers whose knowledge of desert medicine had kept their people alive through centuries of harsh conditions and recent military persecution. Miss Hayes, Joseph had said that first day, emerging from the shadows of the supply tent where he had been inventorying the meager rations. "Your father is the preacher in town, yes? Perhaps he would be interested to know that Agent Caldwell is selling food meant for starving children to buy whiskey and new boots." Rebecca had expected to encounter either the noble savage of romantic literature or the dangerous primitive described in frontier newspapers. Instead, she found herself facing a man whose intelligence, dignity, and quiet intensity challenged every assumption she had been raised to accept about the differences between civilized and savage peoples. Joseph stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the lean build of someone accustomed to long journeys on foot across difficult terrain. His dark hair was cut shorter than traditional Apache style, but longer than white men's fashion, and his clothes combined practical frontier wear with traditional beadwork that spoke to cultural pride, maintained despite forced assimilation. Most striking were his eyes, deep brown and filled with the kind of pain that came from watching everything familiar and sacred being systematically destroyed, yet still holding the fierce intelligence and unexpected humor that had helped him survive. Years in government schools, designed to kill the Indian and save the man. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone who had learned that words could be weapons or tools, depending on how skillfully they were wielded. "What proof do you have of these allegations?" Rebecca had asked, surprising herself with the directness of her response. Joseph had produced a ledger book that documented the discrepancies between government shipments and actual distributions, written in the meticulous handwriting that reflected his forced education in white schools. "I keep records of everything," he had explained. "Someday, someone with authority might be willing to listen." That ledger had become the foundation for a relationship that began with shared outrage over injustice and gradually deepened into something far more dangerous for both of them. Rebecca had initially approached the situation with the righteous indignation of a preacher's daughter, confronted with clear evidence of corruption. She had planned to present Joseph's documentation to her father and trust that proper authorities would address the problems through appropriate channels. But Reverend Thomas Hayes had responded to his daughter's report with the cautious pragmatism of a man who understood that challenging federal officials required more political influence than a frontier preacher possessed. "Rebecca," he had said, reviewing Joseph's careful documentation, "these records may be accurate, but Agent Caldwell has connections in the territorial government that could make life very difficult for anyone who questions his administration." The Reverend's reluctance to act had forced Rebecca to confront uncomfortable truths about the gap between Christian principles and Christian practice in frontier communities. Her father preached regularly about loving one's neighbor and caring for the least among them. But when presented with evidence of systematic abuse directed against Apache families, his primary concern became avoiding political complications that might threaten his own position. "Then we'll have to find other ways to help," Rebecca had told her father, a declaration that marked the beginning of her secret campaign to supplement the inadequate reservation supplies with materials stolen from church stores and purchased with her own limited funds. Those clandestine supply runs had created opportunities for extended conversations with Joseph, during which Rebecca discovered that her assumptions about Apache culture and his assumptions about white civilization were both more complex and more problematic than either had initially recognized. Joseph had been forced to attend a government boarding school from age 8 to 16, where students were beaten for speaking their native language, forced to adopt Christian names, and subjected to an educational program designed to eliminate every trace of tribal identity. "They told us that being Apache meant being savage," Joseph had explained during one of their early conversations, "that our parents were primitive and our traditions were devil worship. They said civilization meant abandoning everything that connected us to our ancestors and our land." Yet despite this systematic cultural assault, Joseph had managed to preserve essential elements of his tribal identity while acquiring the tools necessary to navigate white society. He could speak, read, and write English with fluency that exceeded most frontier settlers, but he also maintained fluent Apache and deep knowledge of traditional practices related to medicine, hunting, and spiritual ceremony. His formal education had given him understanding of federal law and territorial politics, while his cultural heritage provided the moral framework that made Agent Caldwell's corruption both recognizable and intolerable. The hardest part, he had continued, was learning that they were partly right about some things, but completely wrong about what those things meant. Yes, my people fought wars and took scalps and killed enemies in ways that white people consider savage. But white people fight wars and take scalps and kill enemies in ways that Apache people consider savage. The difference isn't civilization versus savagery. It's different ideas about what civilization means and who deserves to be treated as human. These philosophical discussions had occurred during Rebecca's supply deliveries, conversations that gradually shifted from political outrage to personal revelation as both began to recognize that their shared commitment to justice reflected deeper compatibility in values and temperament. Rebecca discovered that Joseph possessed not only the intelligence and education to understand complex moral issues, but also the kind of gentle humor and genuine curiosity about her world that made their meetings the highlight of her week. Joseph, in turn, found in Rebecca something he had been told didn't exist among white people: genuine respect for Apache humanity, combined with willingness to take personal risks to act on that respect. Her theft of medical supplies and food represented more than charity. It demonstrated the kind of moral courage that his own cultural traditions valued above almost any other quality. The transformation from political alliance to personal attachment had been gradual but inevitable. Rebecca began looking forward to their conversations with an intensity that had nothing to do with her humanitarian mission, and everything to do with the way Joseph's presence made her feel more fully herself than she had ever experienced in her father's congregation. Their discussions ranged from theology to territorial politics to personal dreams, revealing intellectual and emotional compatibility that transcended the racial barriers both communities considered absolute. Joseph, meanwhile, found himself thinking about Rebecca during the long, empty hours between her visits, imagining conversations they might have and wondering what it would be like to show her the hidden places in the desert where his people had once lived freely. Her willingness to learn Apache words and customs represented more than political solidarity. It suggested the possibility that someone from the white world might genuinely value Apache culture rather than simply tolerating it. The moment when their relationship shifted from friendship to something deeper occurred 6 weeks before the events that would nearly cost Rebecca her life. She had arrived at the reservation with medical supplies for treating an outbreak of dysentery among the children, only to discover that Joseph himself had fallen ill with the same condition that was threatening the youngest and most vulnerable members of his community. Rebecca had found him in his family's tent, burning with fever and too weak to stand, while his elderly grandmother applied traditional treatments that were helping but not sufficient to overcome the combination of illness and malnutrition that made recovery difficult. Without hesitation, Rebecca had moved into the tent to provide around-the-clock nursing care, using both her father's medical knowledge and the grandmother's herbal expertise to gradually restore Joseph's strength. During the 3 days she spent nursing him back to health, their relationship had crossed every boundary that both their communities considered sacred. They had shared intimate conversations about their deepest fears and dreams. She had learned traditional Apache healing songs from his grandmother, and on the final night of his recovery, when his fever had finally broken, and they both knew he would survive, they had acknowledged the love that had been growing between them for months. "Rebecca," Joseph had whispered in the darkness of the tent, his voice still weak but filled with an intensity that made her heart race. "What we're feeling, it's not possible, not in your world or mine." "I know," she had replied, taking his hand in hers for the first time, "but that doesn't make it less real." The kiss that followed had been gentle, hesitant, and absolutely certain. declaration of love that both knew would require sacrifices neither could fully anticipate. They were crossing a line that neither their families nor their communities would ever forgive, choosing each other despite knowing that such choices had historically ended in violence and tragedy for couples who dared to love across racial boundaries. In frontier territories, but in that moment, surrounded by the quiet breathing of Joseph's sleeping relatives and the vast silence of the desert night, the future had seemed like something they could face together rather than an obstacle that would destroy them. Rebecca had never felt more certain about anything in her life than she did about loving Joseph Crow Feather, and she had been willing to accept whatever consequences that love might bring. She could not have imagined, as she held his hand in the darkness and listened to his steady breathing, that those consequences would include being buried alive by people who claimed to act in the name of Christian civilization. Nor could she have foreseen that salvation would come from an unlikely partnership between the man she loved and a massive Saint Bernard, whose loyalty transcended every boundary that human hatred had tried to establish. But love, Rebecca was about to discover, had a way of creating its own miracles, even in the deepest darkness of human cruelty and despair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks after Rebecca's clandestine nursing of Joseph, their secret relationship faced its first major test when Agent Harrison Caldwell began investigating the mysterious improvement in reservation health conditions. The corrupt federal official had grown suspicious about the reduced death rate among Apache children and the sudden availability of medical supplies that weren't part of his deliberately inadequate distributions. Caldwell was a man in his early 40s whose appointment to the Indian agency had come through political connections rather than any qualification for managing tribal affairs. His primary interest lay in maximizing personal profit from his position, and the systematic starvation of Apache families represented a calculated business strategy rather than mere bureaucratic incompetence. The government allocated substantial funds for reservation supplies, but Caldwell regularly diverted 60% of those resources to private sales, while maintaining official records that documented full distribution to tribal members. This lucrative arrangement required maintaining specific death rates that would justify continued federal funding without triggering investigations from territorial authorities. Too many deaths would attract unwanted attention from military commanders responsible for regional stability, while too few would suggest that current funding levels were unnecessarily generous. Caldwell had calculated the optimal balance with the cold precision of an accountant managing inventory rather than human lives. The recent decline in child mortality had therefore created a serious threat to his financial operations. Someone was clearly supplementing government supplies with outside resources, and Caldwell needed to identify and eliminate that interference before it attracted notice from federal inspectors who might audit his careful bookkeeping. His investigation began with systematic questioning of tribal members about any contact with outside sources of medical care or food supplements. Most Apache families, having learned through bitter experience that cooperation with federal authorities often led to punishment rather than assistance, provided minimal responses that revealed nothing useful about Rebecca's activities. But Caldwell possessed both the patience and the authority to make life increasingly difficult for anyone who failed to provide the information he demanded. "Someone is bringing unauthorized supplies onto this reservation," he announced during a mandatory assembly of all tribal members on a blistering Tuesday morning in late August. "Federal law prohibits outside interference with Indian agency operations, and I will personally ensure that anyone involved in such violations faces appropriate consequences." The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had grown accustomed to wielding absolute power over people who had no legal recourse against his abuse. Caldwell's authority over the reservation was nearly unlimited, backed by military force and federal law that treated tribal members as wards of the government rather than citizens with rights. He could restrict movement, reduce rations, separate families, or recommend individual transfers to distant reservations based on nothing more than his personal assessment of compliance with agency regulations. Joseph had attended that assembly, with growing recognition that Rebecca's supply deliveries were creating dangers neither of them had adequately considered. Her charitable activities violated federal law in ways that could result in her arrest and prosecution, while his acceptance of those supplies could be interpreted as evidence of the kind of outside agitation that federal authorities used to justify harsh crackdowns on tribal autonomy. But the immediate threat to their relationship came from an unexpected source when Caldwell's investigation uncovered evidence that someone had been systematically stealing medical supplies from Reverend Hayes's church dispensary. The discovery occurred when the agent decided to audit all potential sources of the unauthorized reservation aid, including questioning local business owners about unusual purchases of food or medical materials. Dr. Marcus Webb, Millfield's only physician, had mentioned to Caldwell that the church's monthly orders for medical supplies had increased significantly over the past several months, despite no corresponding increase in the congregation's reported health problems. This observation had prompted Caldwell to request an inventory of church medical stores, which revealed shortages that exactly matched the types of supplies that had been appearing on the reservation. Reverend Hayes, Caldwell had said, arriving at the church parsonage on a Wednesday afternoon when Rebecca was preparing for her next supply delivery. I need to discuss some irregularities in your medical supply management. Thomas Hayes had genuinely been unaware of his daughter's theft, having trusted her completely with managing the church's charitable distribution activities. His shock upon discovering Rebecca's systematic deception was compounded by recognition of the legal and political complications her actions had created for his ministry and their families standing in the community. Rebecca, her father had said, after Caldwell departed with promises to pursue federal charges against whoever was responsible for the theft. Please tell me you haven't been involved in taking supplies from our dispensary. The confrontation that followed had forced Rebecca to choose between confessing her activities or allowing suspicion to fall on other church members who had access to medical supplies. Her admission of guilt had devastated her father, not only because of her deception, but because of the implications her actions carried for his own relationship with federal authorities and community leaders who expected him to maintain proper control over his household. Do you understand what you've done? Reverend Hayes had demanded, his voice shaking with a combination of anger and fear. Agent Caldwell has the authority to pursue federal charges for theft of government-regulated medical supplies. You could face prison, and I could lose my ministerial position for harboring a known criminal. But the discovery of Rebecca's theft had represented only the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would ultimately expose the full extent of her relationship with Joseph. Caldwell's investigation had quickly expanded from tracking stolen supplies to identifying the specific individuals on the reservation who had been receiving unauthorized aid. His interrogation methods relied on the systematic application of pressure through reduced rations and threats of family separation until someone provided the information he demanded. The breakthrough had come when he had focused his attention on Joseph's grandmother, an elderly woman whose knowledge of traditional medicine made her a central figure in tribal healthcare. Caldwell had correctly surmised that anyone bringing medical supplies onto the reservation would need to coordinate with established healing practices, and the grandmother's age and cultural authority made her the most likely intermediary for such cooperation. Maria Crow Feather, Caldwell had said, using the Christian name imposed on Joseph's grandmother during the forced relocation. I know someone has been bringing unauthorized medical supplies to your family. I want to know who, when, and why. The elderly woman had initially maintained the stoic silence that characterized most tribal responses to federal questioning. But Caldwell had then threatened to recommend her removal to a different reservation, where she would be separated from her family permanently, a prospect that struck at the deepest fears of tribal members who had already lost so much through government relocations. It was the preacher's daughter, she had finally admitted, her voice barely audible. The young woman with the red hair. She brought medicine for the children and for my grandson when he was sick. This revelation had provided Caldwell with exactly the evidence he needed to pursue criminal charges against Rebecca, while also exposing Joseph's involvement in accepting the stolen supplies. But more importantly, it had confirmed his suspicions that their relationship extended beyond simple charitable activity into the kind of personal attachment that violated both legal restrictions and social taboos. Caldwell's interrogation of the grandmother had revealed that Rebecca had spent 3 consecutive nights in Joseph's family tent during his illness, behavior that suggested intimate involvement rather than mere humanitarian assistance. This information had transformed what might have been treated as misguided charity into something far more scandalous and dangerous for both participants. "Are you telling me," Caldwell had pressed, "that this white woman spent nights alone with Apache men, that she engaged in behavior that violated every principle of Christian morality and racial propriety?" The grandmother's reluctant confirmation of these details had given Caldwell the ammunition he needed not only to pursue criminal charges, but to frame those charges in terms that would generate maximum outrage from Millfield's white community. The theft of medical supplies could be presented as evidence of Rebecca's corruption by savage influences, while her overnight stays on the reservation could be characterized as sexual misconduct that threatened the racial purity that frontier communities considered essential to their survival. Armed with this information, Caldwell had returned to Reverend Hayes with demands that went far beyond simple restitution for stolen supplies. He had presented the minister with a choice between cooperating fully with federal prosecution of Rebecca's crimes or facing investigation himself for harboring and enabling criminal activity directed against government operations. "Your daughter has been stealing federal property and providing aid to hostile Indians," Caldwell had announced during their second meeting. "But more seriously, she has been engaging in inappropriate, intimate contact with Apache men in ways that violate both territorial law and basic Christian morality." The accusation had struck Thomas Hayes like a physical blow. His daughter's theft of medical supplies represented a serious breach of trust and legal violation, but the suggestion that she had engaged in sexual misconduct with Apache men threatened to destroy not only her reputation, but his own standing as a moral leader in the community. "I don't believe such accusations," the Reverend had replied, though his voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been present during their earlier confrontation about the stolen supplies. Caldwell had then produced detailed testimony from Joseph's grandmother describing Rebecca's behavior during her nursing activities, information that could be interpreted as evidence of improper intimacy regardless of the innocent medical necessity that had actually motivated her actions. "Reverend," Caldwell had said with false sympathy, "I understand this information is difficult to accept, but your daughter has been compromised by prolonged exposure to savage influences. The only way to protect her from further corruption is to ensure that she faces appropriate consequences for her criminal behavior, and receives proper guidance about the boundaries that civilized Christian women must maintain. The meeting had concluded with Caldwell's ultimatum. Either Reverend Hayes would cooperate fully with federal prosecution of Rebecca's crimes and publicly denounce her association with Apache individuals, or he would face investigation for criminal conspiracy and removal from his ministerial position for failing to maintain proper moral authority over his household. That evening, Thomas Hayes had confronted his daughter with accusations that forced her to choose between denying her relationship with Joseph or confirming her father's worst fears about her moral corruption. The conversation had taken place in the parsonage kitchen, where Rebecca had been preparing what she now realized would be her final supply delivery to the reservation. "Rebecca," her father had said, his voice heavy with disappointment and fear, "Agent Caldwell has made serious accusations about your behavior on the reservation. I need you to tell me honestly whether you have engaged in any inappropriate conduct with Apache men." The directness of the question had forced Rebecca to confront the reality that her secret relationship had been discovered, and that evasion was no longer possible. Her choice lay between denying her love for Joseph to protect both their families or confirming the relationship and accepting whatever consequences might follow. "Yes," she had said simply, meeting her father's eyes with steady resolve. "I love Joseph Crowfeather and he loves me. We haven't done anything shameful, but we have chosen each other despite knowing that others would consider our love inappropriate." The confession had devastated Thomas Hayes, not only because it confirmed his daughter's involvement in precisely the kind of scandal that could destroy his ministry, but because it revealed that she was willing to prioritize her personal desires over the welfare of their family and community. "Do you understand what this means?" he had demanded. "Agent Caldwell can pursue federal charges for your theft, but now he can also accuse you of moral corruption that will make our entire family outcasts in this community. No decent family will associate with us, and I will lose my position as minister." Rebecca had recognized the truth of her father's concerns, while also understanding that abandoning Joseph would represent a betrayal of everything she had discovered about herself through their relationship. The woman who had fallen in love with an Apache warrior was not the same person who had previously accepted her community's racial prejudices without question. "Father," she had said, choosing her words carefully, "I'm sorry for the difficulties my actions have created for you. But I can't apologize for loving someone whose character and values align more closely with Christian principles than most members of your congregation." This response had made clear to Thomas Hayes that his daughter's attachment to Joseph represented more than youthful rebellion or temporary infatuation. She had undergone a fundamental transformation of beliefs and loyalties that put her permanently at odds with the community that had shaped her upbringing. The realization that he was losing his daughter to a world he could neither understand nor accept had filled the Reverend with despair that would ultimately drive him to make choices that nearly cost Rebecca her life. In trying to save her from what he perceived as moral corruption, Thomas Hayes would become complicit in actions that revealed the true nature of the civilization he claimed to represent. But that night, as Rebecca prepared for what both she and her father knew would be her final journey to the reservation, neither could have predicted that their family crisis would soon escalate into a community-wide hysteria that would culminate in attempted murder disguised as righteous justice. Thus, forces that would soon threaten Rebecca's very survival had been set in motion by her confession of love. But the full extent of the danger would only become clear when Millfield's respectable citizens decided that some crimes against racial propriety deserved punishments more severe than legal prosecution. Word of Rebecca Hayes's confession spread through Millfield like wildfire in dry grass. transforming a scandal about stolen medical supplies into something far more inflammatory that struck at the deepest fears and prejudices of a frontier community already tense with racial animosity. By dawn on Thursday morning, less than 12 hours after her admission to her father, every family in town knew that the preacher's daughter had been conducting a secret romance with an Apache warrior. The transformation of public opinion was swift and merciless. Rebecca had been universally respected as a model of Christian virtue and feminine propriety, someone whose charitable work and dutiful assistance to her father's ministry had made her the standard by which other young women in the community were measured. Her fall from grace carried additional shock because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the reliability of Christian upbringing in protecting white women from what frontier society considered the corrupting influence of savage contact. Martha Collins, the mayor's wife and Millfield's self-appointed guardian of social propriety, had been among the first to hear the news when Agent Caldwell visited her husband to discuss the implications of Rebecca's criminal activities for community security. Her reaction set the tone for much of what followed. "I always knew there was something unnatural about that girl," Martha had declared to the circle of women who gathered at her kitchen table each morning to discuss community affairs. "No decent Christian woman spends that much time ministering to savages without being corrupted by their heathen influences. This proves that mixing our race with theirs leads inevitably to moral degradation." The speed with which Rebecca's former virtues were reinterpreted as evidence of hidden corruption revealed the fragility of her social standing and the predetermined nature of community judgment once racial boundaries had been crossed. Her charitable work, previously praised as Christian compassion, now became proof of susceptibility to primitive influences. Her independence and intelligence, formerly appreciated as signs of proper upbringing, were suddenly viewed as dangerous qualities that had enabled her seduction by savage cunning. Mayor Benjamin Collins called an emergency town meeting for Thursday evening to address what he characterized as a threat to community safety and moral standards that required immediate collective action. The announcement, posted throughout Millfield during the afternoon, framed Rebecca's relationship with Joseph in terms that deliberately inflamed existing tensions between the white settlement and the nearby Apache reservation. Citizens. The notice read, "Recent revelations about criminal activities and moral corruption involving unauthorized contact between our community and the Apache reservation require urgent discussion of measures necessary to protect our families and preserve Christian civilization in Millfield." The language was carefully chosen to suggest that Rebecca's actions represented not merely personal misconduct, but a broader pattern of savage infiltration that threatened the security and moral integrity of the entire community. By linking her relationship with Joseph to concerns about criminal activity and community safety, the mayor was positioning the town meeting as a forum for collective self-defense rather than simple moral judgment. Joseph, meanwhile, had learned of Rebecca's exposure through his grandmother, who had been devastated by her forced revelation to Agent Caldwell. The elderly woman had sought him out immediately after Caldwell's interrogation to warn him that federal authorities now possessed detailed information about his relationship with the preacher's daughter. "They made me tell them about the white woman," she had said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "The agent threatened to send me away from my family forever if I didn't explain about her visits and her time in our tent when you were sick." Joseph had understood immediately that his grandmother faced impossible choices under Caldwell's questioning. Federal authorities possessed unlimited power to separate tribal families, relocate individuals to distant reservations, or impose punishments. that could destroy what remained of Apache social structures. Her cooperation with the investigation had been a survival strategy rather than betrayal, but the consequences for both Rebecca and himself would be severe, regardless of her motivations. "You did what you had to do, grandmother," he had told her gently. "The fault lies with those who created this situation, not with you for surviving it as best you could." But Joseph's acceptance of his grandmother's actions didn't diminish his. Recognition that Rebecca now faced dangers he was powerless to prevent. As an Apache man under federal supervision, he possessed no legal standing to challenge whatever accusations might be brought against her, while any attempt to contact her directly would only provide additional evidence of their forbidden relationship. So, isolation imposed by their circumstances was particularly bitter because Joseph understood exactly what Rebecca was facing in her white community. His own experience with racial prejudice in government boarding schools had taught him how quickly former friends and supporters could turn hostile once tribal identity became a source of shame rather than mere curiosity. The difference was that Rebecca's community possessed the legal authority to punish her transgression in ways that his people, as federal wards, could not resist or challenge. Thursday evening's town meeting filled Millfield's small church beyond capacity, with additional attendees gathering outside the building to hear proceedings through open windows. The turnout reflected not only genuine community concern, but also the kind of morbid fascination that public scandals generated in isolated frontier settlements where entertainment options were limited and social drama served important functions in reinforcing collective values. Reverend Hayes had been forced to preside over the meeting in his capacity as the community's primary moral authority, a responsibility that placed him in the impossible position of condemning his own daughter's actions while attempting to maintain some semblance of paternal protection. His opening remarks revealed the internal conflict that was tearing him apart. "Fellow Christians," he had begun, his voice strained with emotion, "we gather tonight to address a situation that challenges our fundamental beliefs about proper Christian conduct and the boundaries that must be maintained between civilized society and savage influences. My own family has been touched by this tragedy, and I stand before you seeking both justice and mercy as we determine how to respond." The carefully balanced language reflected Thomas Hayes's desperate attempt to acknowledge Rebecca's wrongdoing, while positioning himself as a victim rather than an enabler of her actions. But the community was in no mood for nuanced moral distinctions, and the Reverend's attempt at moderation was quickly overwhelmed by voices calling for more decisive action. Dr. Marcus Webb, whose medical training gave his opinions additional authority, had been among the first to speak after the Reverend's introduction. "This situation represents more than simple moral failure," he had declared. "Miss Hayes's prolonged contact with Apache men has exposed her to influences that threaten not only her own soul, but the safety of every family in this community." Webb's medical credentials allowed him to frame Rebecca's relationship with Joseph in terms of contagion and disease, suggesting that her moral corruption could spread to other community members if not properly contained. "We know from scientific study that prolonged exposure to primitive peoples leads to degenerative changes in civilized individuals. Miss Hayes's behavior provides clear evidence of such degeneration, and we must take steps to prevent further contamination." The pseudo-scientific language gave respectable cover to racial hatred while positioning extreme measures as necessary medical intervention rather than simple punishment. Webb's diagnosis of moral contamination requiring quarantine would prove crucial in justifying the community's ultimate decision about Rebecca's fate. Agent Caldwell, attending the meeting as a federal representative, had used his authority to frame Rebecca's actions in terms of national security and legal violation. The unauthorized provision of supplies to reservation Indians represents a federal crime that undermines government policy designed to maintain peace and order in territorial regions, he had announced. But more seriously, the intimate contact between white women and Apache men threatens the racial boundaries that prevent savage uprisings and maintain civilized control over hostile populations. Caldwell's presentation transformed Rebecca's charitable activities into evidence of a broader pattern of Apache manipulation designed to corrupt white women and gain intelligence about community vulnerabilities. His federal authority gave credibility to conspiracy theories that painted Joseph as a calculating savage who had seduced Rebecca as part of a broader tribal plot against white settlement. "We have evidence," Caldwell had continued, "that this Apache man used his government education to manipulate Miss Hayes's Christian compassion for criminal purposes. His ability to speak English and his knowledge of white customs made him particularly dangerous because he could appear civilized while maintaining savage loyalties that threaten everything we've built in this territory." The agent's characterization of Joseph as an educated savage who had weaponized his assimilation training resonated powerfully with community fears about the failure of government Indian policy. If Apache men could learn to mimic civilization while retaining their primitive nature, then no white woman was safe from seduction and corruption. Martha Collins had then taken the floor to address what she characterized as the broader implications of Rebecca's moral failure for community safety and social order. This situation proves that Christian charity, when misdirected toward savages, becomes a pathway for moral corruption that threatens the purity of our race and the safety of our children, she had declared. Miss Hayes was raised in a Christian home with every advantage of civilized education, yet she fell prey to savage manipulation because she was allowed to venture beyond the proper boundaries of feminine Christian service. We must ensure that such corruption cannot spread to other young women in our community. Collins's speech had effectively positioned Rebecca's punishment as necessary protection for other community members who might be tempted to similar charitable activities. The logic suggested that mercy toward Rebecca would represent cruelty toward future victims of Apache seduction, making harsh measures appear both necessary and compassionate. The meeting had continued for nearly 3 hours as various community members offered increasingly extreme suggestions for addressing what they characterized as an unprecedented threat to Christian civilization. The proposals ranged from formal legal prosecution through territorial courts to immediate exile from the community, with several speakers suggesting that conventional punishment was inadequate for crimes that threatened racial boundaries. It was during the final hour of discussion that Samuel Morrison, the town's undertaker and a man whose profession had given him intimate familiarity with death in all its forms, had made the suggestion that would ultimately determine Rebecca's fate. "Fellow citizens," Morrison had said, rising slowly from his seat near the back of the church, "I've listened carefully to tonight's discussion, and I believe we're overlooking the true nature of this situation. Miss Hayes hasn't simply committed a crime or fallen into sin. She has died to everything that made her a member of civilized Christian society." The metaphorical language had captured the attention of the entire assembly, providing a framework for understanding Rebecca's transgression that went beyond legal or moral categories into something approaching religious doctrine. "When a Christian woman chooses savage love over civilized virtue," Morrison had continued, "she ceases to exist as the person she once was. The Rebecca Hayes we knew and respected died the moment she embraced Apache corruption. What remains is a creature that wears her form but serves savage interests that threaten everything we hold sacred." Morrison's declaration that Rebecca had symbolically died through her relationship with Joseph provided the foundation for what would follow. If she was already dead to civilized society, then treating her as literally dead represented not murder, but simple recognition of an accomplished fact. "I propose," Morrison had concluded, "that we acknowledge this death formally and permanently, ensuring that the corruption she represents can never again threaten our community or our children." The undertaker's proposal had been met with solemn nodding from most attendees, as if he had articulated a truth that others had sensed but been unable to express. The idea that Rebecca's moral death required physical confirmation appealed to a community that needed to believe their actions served justice rather than simple vengeance. Mayor Collins had called for a formal vote on Morrison's proposal, framing it as a choice between protecting community safety and enabling further moral corruption. The result had been overwhelmingly in favor of treating Rebecca Hayes as dead to Millfield society, with only 3 dissenting voices among the more than 60 community members present. As the meeting had concluded with plans for implementing Morrison's proposal, none of the participants had acknowledged what they were actually planning. The language of symbolic death and moral quarantine provided psychological cover for what was essentially a decision to commit murder while maintaining their self-image as righteous Christian defenders of civilization. But in the darkness beyond, Millfield's boundaries, 2 unlikely allies were already preparing to challenge the community's judgment. Joseph Crowfeather had been watching the church from a distance during the town meeting, and Thunder, his massive St. Bernard companion, had sensed the danger threatening the woman who had shown kindness to their family during Joseph's illness. Set 2. Dog's loyalty transcended every boundary that human hatred had tried to establish, and his determination to protect Rebecca would soon prove stronger than the community's conviction that some crimes deserved the ultimate punishment. Friday morning dawned grey and cold over Millfield, with autumn storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains like harbingers of the darkness about to descend on Rebecca Hayes. She woke in her father's parsonage, knowing that her life as she had known it was over, but not yet understanding the full extent of the danger that the previous night's town meeting had set in motion. The first sign of her transformed status came when Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, who had been bringing fresh bread to the parsonage twice weekly for the past 3 years, failed to appear at her usual time. Rebecca waited until mid-morning before walking to the bakery herself, only to find the woman who had once greeted her with genuine warmth now regarding her with the kind of fearful revulsion typically reserved for carriers of infectious disease. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Patterson had said, refusing to meet Rebecca's eyes, "but I can't continue providing services to your household. The town council has advised all business owners to cease commercial relationships with families that harbor criminal elements." The rejection stung, not only because of its personal cruelty, but because it revealed how quickly and thoroughly her community had moved to implement social isolation as punishment for her transgressions. Rebecca understood that she was witnessing the systematic destruction of every connection that had once anchored her to Millfield society. Similar rejections followed throughout the morning as Rebecca attempted to purchase supplies at the general store, arrange for delivery of firewood, and even collect mail from the territorial post office. Each encounter reinforced the message that she was now considered a pariah whose very presence contaminated anyone who acknowledged her humanity. The most painful rejection came from Sarah Miller, a young woman near Rebecca's own age, who had been her closest friend since childhood. They had shared confidences about everything from romantic dreams to theological questions, and Rebecca had naturally hoped that personal affection might transcend the community's collective judgment. Sarah, Rebecca had called when she spotted her former friend leaving the general store. I need to explain what really happened with Agent Caldwell's accusations. But Sarah had turned away without acknowledgement, walking quickly toward her family's wagon as if Rebecca's voice carried some form of spiritual pollution that could be avoided through simple physical distance. The deliberate nature of the snub made clear that their friendship had been permanently severed by community pressure and Sarah's own acceptance of the town's characterization of Rebecca's moral corruption. By afternoon, Rebecca realized that her social isolation was merely the preliminary stage of a more comprehensive punishment that the community was systematically implementing. Mayor Collins arrived at the parsonage shortly after noon with an official notice that outlined the terms of her continued residence in Millfield. "Miss Hayes," the mayor had announced formally, "the town council has determined that your criminal activities and moral corruption pose an ongoing threat to community safety and social order. You are hereby restricted to this property until such time as federal authorities can arrange for your trial and removal from Millfield." The house arrest was presented as protective custody designed to prevent further contact between Rebecca and Apache individuals, but its true purpose was to ensure her availability for whatever final punishment the community was planning. The mayor's official language couldn't quite disguise the reality that Rebecca was now effectively a prisoner awaiting execution. "What about my father's ministerial duties?" Rebecca had asked, recognizing that her confinement would make it impossible for her to assist with church activities that had become integral to community religious life. "Reverend Hayes will continue his pastoral responsibilities," Collins had replied coldly, "but your participation in church activities is no longer appropriate given your moral status. The congregation requires spiritual leadership untainted by association with savage corruption." The mayor's response made clear that Rebecca's punishment was designed not only to isolate her from the community, but to force her father to choose between his daughter and his ministerial position. The pressure on Thomas Hayes was deliberate, intended to eliminate any potential source of support for Rebecca within Millfield's power structure. Evening brought the arrival of Samuel Morrison, whose undertaker's profession had made him the logical choice for implementing the community's decision about Rebecca's symbolic death. He appeared at the parsonage door shortly after sunset, accompanied by two other men whose faces were partially concealed by darkness and their obvious discomfort. With their assigned task, "Miss Hayes," Morrison had said, with the same professional courtesy he typically displayed when consoling bereaved families, "I've come to discuss arrangements for tomorrow evening's ceremony." The euphemistic language initially confused Rebecca, who hadn't yet understood the full implications of the previous night's town meeting. She had expected legal prosecution or forced exile, not the ritualized symbolic death that Morrison was planning to implement. "What kind of ceremony?" she had asked, though something in Morrison's manner had already begun to trigger deep instinctive alarm. "The community has determined that your moral death requires formal acknowledgement," Morrison had explained, with the calm precision of someone discussing funeral arrangements for an elderly relative. "Tomorrow evening, we'll conduct a burial service that recognizes the end of your existence as a member of Christian civilization." The word burial had sent ice through Rebecca's veins as she began to comprehend what the undertaker was actually describing. "You're planning to bury me alive," she had whispered, the enormity of their intention hitting her like a physical blow. "The ceremony will be conducted with appropriate dignity," Morrison had replied, as if the method of murder somehow mattered less than its symbolic meaning. "You'll be placed in a pine box with sufficient air holes to ensure your comfort during the initial stages of the ritual. The actual interment will proceed according to Christian burial customs," Morrison's clinical description of her planned murder revealed the psychological mechanisms that allowed respectable community members to participate in what they understood to be homicide, while maintaining their self-image as moral, law-abiding Christians. By framing the killing as symbolic death and using the familiar rituals of church burial, they could avoid confronting the reality of what they were actually doing. The ceremony will take place at sunset tomorrow in the town cemetery. Morrison had continued, "Your father will be invited to deliver appropriate remarks about the spiritual significance of your transition from corrupted earthly existence to whatever judgment awaits those who choose savage love over Christian virtue." The invitation for Thomas Hayes to participate in his daughter's murder represented the final twist of psychological torture that the community was inflicting on their family. By requiring the Reverend to officiate at Rebecca's burial, they were forcing him to publicly endorse her execution while maintaining the fiction that they were conducting a legitimate religious ceremony rather than committing premeditated murder. After Morrison departed with his companions, Rebecca found herself alone with her father for what both understood would likely be their final private conversation. Thomas Hayes had remained silent during the undertaker's visit, his face displaying the kind of numb shock that suggested complete psychological breakdown in the face of impossible moral choices. "Father," Rebecca had said gently, reaching for his hand across the kitchen table where they had shared countless meals and conversations throughout her childhood. "You don't have to participate in whatever they're planning. You can refuse to conduct their ceremony." But Thomas Hayes had looked at his daughter with eyes that reflected the complete destruction of everything he had believed about Christian civilization and his own moral authority. "If I refuse to participate," he had replied in a voice barely above a whisper, "they'll find someone else to conduct the service, and I'll lose any possibility of protecting you during your final hours." The Reverend's response revealed his understanding that Rebecca's death was now inevitable, and that his only remaining choice lay between abandoning her completely or maintaining some paternal presence during her murder. The community had structured their ultimatum to ensure that even protective instincts would serve their purposes by providing religious legitimacy to their planned execution. "Besides," Thomas Hayes had continued, his voice breaking with despair, "what kind of father allows his daughter to choose damnation over salvation? Perhaps this ceremony will shock you into repenting your corrupted attachment to that Apache savage." Rebecca had realized with horrifying clarity that her father genuinely believed the community's characterization of her relationship with Joseph as spiritual corruption requiring extreme intervention. His willingness to participate in her murder reflected not simple cowardice but sincere conviction that killing her body might somehow save her soul from what he considered worse spiritual destruction. "Father," she had said, trying one final time to reach the man who had raised her with love and taught her Christian principles of mercy and forgiveness, "Joseph Crow Feather is a good man whose character reflects Christian values better than most members of your congregation. Loving him hasn't corrupted me. It's revealed the hypocrisy and hatred that this community calls civilization." But Thomas Hayes had been too broken by the destruction of his worldview to hear her words as anything other than additional evidence of how completely savage influences had poisoned her judgment. The daughter who challenged his community's racial prejudices had become unrecognizable to him, transformed into something he could no longer understand or protect. As night settled over Millfield, Rebecca found herself essentially alone with the knowledge that she would be murdered within 24 hours by people who considered themselves righteous Christians acting in defense of civilized society. The isolation was made more bitter by the realization that her father would participate in her execution while believing he was performing a sacred duty. But 3 miles away on the Apache reservation, Joseph Crow Feather was preparing to challenge the community's judgment in ways that would test every skill he had learned during his forced education in white schools and his traditional Apache training in wilderness survival. His love for Rebecca had given him purpose that transcended personal safety, and his determination to save her would soon place him in direct conflict with federal authority and community hatred. More importantly, Thunder, the massive St. Bernard, who had appeared at the reservation 6 months earlier as a stray and been adopted by Joseph's family, was displaying behavior that suggested the dog sensed approaching danger to someone he had learned to protect. The animal's restlessness and constant attention to sounds from the direction of Millfield indicated instincts that might prove crucial in the desperate rescue attempt that Joseph was already planning. Rebecca spent her final night of freedom, writing letters she would never be able to send, documenting her love for Joseph and her refusal to repent choices that had revealed both the best and worst aspects of the communities that claimed to represent Christian civilization. Her words reflected not despair but defiance, the determination of someone who had discovered that some values were worth dying for, even when death came at the hands of people who claimed to act in God's name. Outside her window, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened, sending rain against the glass like tears for innocence about to be destroyed by the very forces that claimed to protect it. But somewhere in the darkness beyond the parsonage, hope moved on, 4 legs through the mud and rain, guided by loyalty that knew no boundaries and love that would not accept defeat. The trap was closing around Rebecca Hayes, but the forces that would ultimately save her were already moving through the night, driven by bonds stronger than hatred and more enduring than the temporary madness that had seized her community. Tomorrow would bring either death or deliverance, and the outcome would depend on courage, love, and the extraordinary determination of those who refused to let evil triumph in the name of righteousness. Saturday evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate not just the air, but the very soul of Millfield, as if nature itself recoiled from the horror about to unfold in the town cemetery. Rebecca Hayes sat in her father's parsonage, dressed in the simple white gown that Samuel Morrison had delivered that morning. A burial shroud disguised as ceremonial attire, complete with the kind of modest neckline and long sleeves that the community deemed appropriate for a woman facing judgment for moral corruption. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca that her executioners had chosen white fabric to symbolize the purity they claimed she had forfeited through her love for Joseph. The color served their narrative that they were attempting to restore her innocence through death, cleansing her corrupted soul by separating it from the body that had been tainted by Apache contact. At 5 o'clock, Mayor Collins arrived with a formal escort consisting of Dr. Webb, Agent Caldwell, and 4 other men whose faces Rebecca recognized from her father's congregation. They had come to collect her for the ceremony with the same solemn dignity typically reserved for accompanying grieving families to funeral services, their demeanor suggesting they genuinely believed they were performing a sacred duty rather than committing murder. "Miss Hayes," Mayor Collins had announced, "it's time to proceed to the cemetery for the ceremony that will conclude this unfortunate situation." Rebecca had risen from her chair with as much dignity as she could summon, refusing to provide her killers with the satisfaction of seeing her beg or collapse into hysteria. If she was going to die for loving Joseph Crow Feather, she would face that death with the same courage that had enabled her to choose love over social acceptance in the first place. "May I have a moment alone with my father?" she had requested, hoping for some final word of affection or even acknowledgement that their relationship had once meant something beyond the community obligations that now demanded her death. But Thomas Hayes had been unable to meet his daughter's eyes. his face displaying the same numb devastation that had characterized his behavior since Morrison's visit. "The ceremony will provide appropriate time for spiritual reflection," he had replied mechanically, as if reading from a script prepared by others. The walk to Millfield Cemetery took 15 minutes through streets lined with townspeople who had gathered to witness Rebecca's final journey. Their faces reflected not the grief typically associated with funeral processions, but the kind of morbid fascination and righteous satisfaction that attended public executions. Children peered from behind their parents' legs with the wide-eyed curiosity of innocence, witnessing something they sensed was momentous but couldn't fully comprehend. Mrs. Collins held her young daughter's hand while explaining in stage whispers that they were watching a woman who had chosen to become corrupted by savage influences face the consequences of abandoning Christian virtue. "Remember this lesson, Sarah," she had said loud enough for Rebecca to hear. "This is what happens to women who forget their proper place in God's plan for civilized society." The cemetery occupied a hill overlooking Millfield, surrounded by a whitewashed fence that someone had repaired and painted specifically for the evening's ceremony. Fresh flowers decorated several graves, and lanterns had been positioned throughout the grounds to provide illumination for the proceedings. The careful preparations gave the scene an almost festive atmosphere that made the planned murder seem like a community celebration rather than a crime. At the cemetery's center, Samuel Morrison had prepared what he presented as a traditional burial site, complete with a freshly dug grave and a pine coffin that rested on wooden supports above the dark opening in the earth. The coffin's lid had been propped open to display the white satin interior where Rebecca would spend her final moments, and several small holes had been drilled in the sides, ostensibly to provide air during the initial stages of the ceremony, but actually designed to prolong her suffering by preventing immediate suffocation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Hayes had begun, his voice barely audible as he addressed the assembled crowd, "we gather this evening to witness the spiritual consequences of moral choices that have separated one of our community members from the salvation that Christian civilization provides." The Reverend's opening remarks established the theological framework that allowed the assembled townspeople to view Rebecca's murder as divine justice rather than human cruelty. By characterizing her death as spiritual consequence rather than community punishment, they could maintain their self-image as instruments of God's will rather than participants in premeditated homicide. Rebecca Hayes was raised in this community with every advantage of Christian education and proper feminine guidance, Thomas Hayes had continued, reading from notes that seemed to have been prepared by others. Yet she chose to abandon these blessings in favor of attachment to savage influences that have corrupted her soul and threatened the moral foundations of our society. Each word felt like a knife in Rebecca's chest, not because of the accusations themselves, but because they were being delivered by the man who had raised her to value love, compassion, and moral courage above social conformity. Her father's participation in her execution represented the complete victory of community pressure over paternal affection. "The ceremony we conduct tonight," the Reverend had concluded, "serves as both punishment for moral transgression and opportunity for final repentance before this corrupted soul faces whatever judgment awaits those who choose savage love over Christian virtue." After her father's remarks, Agent Caldwell had stepped forward to provide the federal authority that legitimized the community's actions as law enforcement rather than vigilante justice. "The criminal activities that brought us to this point," he had announced, "represent violations of federal law governing contact between white citizens and reservation Indians. Miss Hayes's theft of government property and unauthorized aid to hostile tribes constitute acts of treason against civilized authority." Caldwell's characterization of Rebecca's charitable activities as treason provided legal justification for extreme punishment, while reinforcing the community's belief that they were defending national security rather than simply expressing racial hatred. His federal credentials gave official sanction to what might otherwise have appeared to be simple mob violence. Dr. Webb had then offered the medical perspective that framed Rebecca's execution as therapeutic intervention designed to prevent the spread of moral contamination to other community members. The degenerative changes that prolonged contact with primitive peoples produces in civilized individuals, he had declared, require decisive treatment to prevent further corruption of healthy social bonds. The pseudo-scientific language provided rational justification for what was essentially ritual murder, allowing educated members of the community to participate without acknowledging their abandonment of both legal and moral principles. Webb's medical authority made extreme measures appear scientifically necessary rather than merely emotionally satisfying. As the formal speeches concluded, Morrison had gestured toward the open coffin with the same professional courtesy he displayed when helping bereaved families with funeral arrangements. "Miss Hayes," he had said gently, "it's time to take your place for the ceremony that will conclude your earthly existence and begin whatever spiritual journey awaits corrupted souls." Rebecca had approached the coffin with steady steps, refusing to provide her executioners with the drama they seemed to expect. If her community demanded her death for loving Joseph Crowfeather, she would give them a dignified victim rather than a broken woman begging for mercy from people who had already demonstrated their complete lack of Christian compassion. The coffin's interior had been lined with white satin that felt cold against her skin as she lay down in the narrow space that would serve as her tomb. The sides pressed against her shoulders, and the proximity of the lid made breathing difficult even before. Morrison began the process of sealing her inside. "Any final words?" Morrison had asked, though his tone suggested that repentance was the only acceptable response. "I love Joseph Crowfeather," Rebecca had replied clearly, her voice carrying across the cemetery to every assembled witness. "I don't repent that love, and I don't acknowledge your authority to judge it. You're committing murder in God's name, and no amount of ceremony will change that truth." Her defiant final statement had clearly angered several community members who had expected humble submission or at least acknowledgement of their moral authority. But Morrison had proceeded with sealing the coffin lid, using nails and a hammer to secure the wooden barrier that would prevent Rebecca from escaping her tomb. The sound of each nail being driven into place had reverberated through the coffin, like gunshots, marking the final moments of Rebecca's life as a free woman. The air inside the narrow space had immediately become stifling, though the small holes Morrison had drilled would provide enough oxygen to keep her conscious during the lowering and initial burial process. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, Reverend," Hayes had intoned as Morrison and his assistants had used ropes to lower the coffin into the open grave. "May God have mercy on this corrupted soul and grant her whatever peace is possible for those who choose damnation over salvation." The first shovelful of earth had struck the coffin lid with a hollow thump that echoed through the wooden chamber, where Rebecca lay fighting panic and struggling to maintain hope that somehow, against all probability, rescue might still be possible. Each subsequent shovelful had reduced the sound from the outside world, while increasing the terrible finality of her situation. But as the burial proceeded and darkness closed around the cemetery, forces were already moving through the night that would soon challenge the community's assumption that their judgment was final. 3 miles away on the Apache reservation, Joseph Crowfeather had been preparing for the most dangerous mission of his life, while thunder, The massive Saint Bernard, whose loyalty transcended every boundary that human hatred had established, was already running through the darkness toward the sound of shovels hitting earth. Rebecca's ordeal in the suffocating darkness of her premature grave was only beginning. But so was the rescue attempt that would test whether love and courage could overcome the combined forces of racial prejudice, federal authority, and community-sanctioned murder. The people of Millfield believed they had buried their problem along with the woman who had dared to love across racial boundaries. They had no idea that their victim's salvation was already racing toward them through the desert night, driven by bonds that proved stronger than hatred and more enduring than the temporary madness that had seized their supposedly Christian community. 6 feet beneath the Arizona earth, Rebecca Hayes existed in a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against her eyes and lungs with suffocating intensity. The narrow confines of her pine coffin allowed no movement beyond the slight shifting of her shoulders and the careful positioning of her hands against the wooden lid that separated her from life itself. Each breath came shallow and precious, rationed by the small holes that Morrison had drilled to prolong her suffering rather than preserve her life. The sounds from above had gradually diminished as the burial party completed their grisly work and began dispersing back to their homes, satisfied that justice had been served and moral order restored to their community. The final voices had faded 20 minutes earlier, leaving Rebecca alone with the terrible silence of the grave and the growing realization that rescue, if it came at all, might arrive too late to matter. Time became fluid in the absolute darkness. Rebecca couldn't tell whether minutes or hours had passed since the last shovelful of dirt had struck her wooden tomb. Her father's pocket watch, which she had carried in her dress pocket during better days, was useless without light to read its face. She was trapped not only in space, but in a terrifying present tense, where each moment stretched toward eternity while her oxygen supply steadily diminished. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical discomfort. Rebecca's mind raced through memories of her relationship with Joseph, wondering if their love had been worth the price she was now paying. In the suffocating darkness, doubts crept in like poison. Not doubts about Joseph's character or the validity of their feelings, but questions about whether she could have found some way to protect their love without triggering the community's murderous response. She thought of conversations they had shared during her supply runs to the reservation, moments when Joseph had revealed the pain of watching his people slowly die under federal policies designed to eliminate Apache culture through systematic neglect. His understanding of systematic oppression had prepared him for the possibility that their relationship would face violent opposition. But Rebecca wondered if either of them had truly grasped how quickly apparent civilization could transform into savage brutality. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being murdered by people who justified their actions by claiming moral superiority over Apache savages. The very community that preached Christian love and forgiveness had planned and executed her death with methodical cruelty that exceeded anything she had heard attributed to hostile tribes. Her executioners had used religious ceremony and legal authority to legitimize what was essentially ritual murder, proving that civilization was often just savagery dressed in more respectable clothing. Above ground, the cemetery had returned to its normal, peaceful silence, but that tranquility was about to be shattered by the arrival of forces that would challenge everything Millfield believed about racial boundaries and the permanence of their judgment. Thunder, the massive Saint Bernard, whose loyalty transcended human prejudice, had been running steadily toward the cemetery for over an hour, guided by instincts that had detected Rebecca's distress from miles away. The dog's extraordinary size, and strength made him capable of feats that would have been impossible for ordinary animals. At nearly 200 pounds, with powerful shoulders and determined intelligence, Thunder possessed both the physical capability and emotional motivation necessary to attempt what any rational assessment would consider impossible: digging through 6 feet of packed earth to reach a buried human being. Joseph Crow Feather followed Thunder through the darkness, carrying rope, tools, and a desperate hope that they weren't already too late to save the woman he loved. His Apache training in night movement and wilderness survival allowed him to travel silently across terrain that would have challenged most white men even in daylight. Years of government boarding school education had taught him to think strategically about problems that required both physical capability and careful planning. But Joseph's rescue mission faced obstacles beyond simple physical challenges. His presence near Millfield represented a violation of federal regulations governing Apache movement outside reservation boundaries, and his obvious intention to interfere with what the community considered legitimate justice would provide Agent Caldwell with justification for extreme response. If caught, Joseph would face not only personal punishment, but potential retaliation against his entire family and tribal community. The risk was enormous, but Joseph had made his choice the moment he learned of Rebecca's planned execution. Love had taught him that some things were worth any sacrifice, and Rebecca's courage in choosing him, despite knowing the consequences, had revealed a kind of moral strength that deserved protection regardless of personal cost. Thunder reached the cemetery first, arriving at the freshly disturbed earth of Rebecca's grave with the focused intensity of an animal whose protective instincts had been fully aroused. The dog's extraordinary sense of hearing allowed him to detect the faint sounds of Rebecca's movement within her coffin, confirming that she was still alive and providing specific guidance about where to concentrate his digging efforts. Without hesitation, Thunder began excavating with the kind of determined fury that only love could inspire. His massive paws threw dirt aside with machine-like efficiency, creating a depression that grew steadily deeper despite the difficulty of the packed earth. The dog's powerful claws and relentless energy gradually carved a shaft toward the coffin that held the woman who had shown kindness to his adopted family during their time of need. Inside her wooden tomb, Rebecca gradually became aware of sounds from above that seemed too purposeful to be natural settling of the grave. The rhythm of digging was unmistakable, though she couldn't imagine who might be attempting to reach her at this late hour. Her heart began racing with a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Morrison had sealed her coffin lid. The digging continued with relentless determination, punctuated by the occasional sound of rocks being displaced and dirt cascading down the growing shaft. Rebecca pressed her ear against the coffin lid, straining to hear any sound that might indicate the identity of her potential rescuer. When she finally heard Thunder's distinctive panting, recognition flooded through her with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. Joseph's family had adopted the massive St. Bernard 6 months earlier when the dog had appeared at the reservation as a stray, clearly having traveled great distances to reach them. Thunder had immediately attached himself to Joseph with the kind of loyalty that suggested recognition of kindred spirits. The dog's presence during Rebecca's nursing visits had always been comforting, but she had never imagined that his protective instincts might someday save her life. Joseph arrived at the cemetery to find Thunder already several feet down in his excavation of Rebecca's grave, working with single-minded determination that demonstrated how completely the dog understood the urgency of their mission. The sight of the massive animal digging desperately through the night to reach a buried human being would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the extraordinary bonds that could develop between different species united by common purpose, "Good boy, Thunder," Joseph whispered, dropping to his knees beside the growing hole and adding his own efforts to the dog's excavation. "We're going to get her out of there." Joseph's hands were smaller than Thunder's massive paws, but his human intelligence allowed him to work more strategically, removing larger rocks and directing their efforts toward the most efficient path, to Rebecca's coffin. His Apache training had taught him techniques for rapid excavation that proved invaluable in their race against time and Rebecca's dwindling oxygen supply. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Each shovelful of dirt removed threatened to cause cave-ins that could bury both rescuers or make Rebecca's situation even more desperate. Joseph had to balance speed with safety, ensuring that their rescue attempt didn't accidentally cause the very death they were trying to prevent. But as they dug deeper, the sounds from Rebecca's coffin became more audible, providing confirmation that she was still conscious and aware of their efforts. Her tapping against the coffin lid created a rhythm that helped guide their excavation toward the exact location where their work would be most effective. "Rebecca," Joseph called softly when they were close enough for her to hear his voice. "Can you hear me? We're coming to get you out of there." The response was immediate, a pattern of taps that spelled out yes in the code they had developed during their clandestine correspondence. Rebecca's ability to communicate clearly indicated that she retained enough oxygen and mental clarity to participate actively in her own rescue, dramatically improving their chances of success. But their efforts had not gone entirely unnoticed. The sounds of digging and the presence of disturbed earth at the cemetery had attracted attention from a source that would soon threaten everything they had accomplished. Agent Caldwell, unable to sleep after the evening's events, had decided to make a final inspection of the burial site to ensure that the community's justice had been properly implemented. What he discovered upon arriving at the cemetery would trigger a confrontation that would test whether love and loyalty could overcome federal authority and community hatred. The rescue that had seemed so close to success was about to face its greatest challenge, as the forces that had buried Rebecca alive prepared to defend their actions against anyone brave enough or foolish enough to challenge their judgment. Thunder's massive form silhouetted against the night sky as he continued digging with desperate determination, while Joseph worked frantically to reach the woman they both loved before their enemies could stop them. Far below in her coffin tomb, Rebecca listened to the sounds of salvation approaching and gathered what remained of her strength for the final effort that would either free her from the grave or seal her fate forever. The battle for Rebecca's life was about to begin in earnest, fought not with weapons or armies, but with the most powerful forces known to humanity. Love that refused to accept defeat, loyalty that transcended every boundary, and courage that enabled ordinary beings to attempt the impossible when everything they valued was at stake. Agent Harrison Caldwell's lantern cast dancing shadows across the cemetery as he approached the freshly disturbed earth that marked Rebecca. Hayes's grave, his federal authority giving him confidence that whatever disturbance he was investigating would yield to his official intervention. What he discovered upon reaching the burial site, however, challenged every assumption he had made about Apache capabilities and the finality of community justice. The massive excavation pit revealed not only the extraordinary determination of Rebecca's rescuers, but also the kind of coordinated intelligence that contradicted federal stereotypes about primitive Indian behavior. Thunder's digging had been systematic rather than random, creating a shaft that minimized cave-in risks while maximizing access to the buried coffin. Joseph's strategic additions to the excavation showed evidence of engineering knowledge that exceeded what government boarding schools were supposed to teach their Apache students. "Stop immediately!" Caldwell commanded, drawing his service revolver and aiming it toward the figures working frantically in the excavated grave. "You're interfering with federal law enforcement and violating territorial regulations governing Indian movement outside reservation boundaries." Joseph paused in his digging, but didn't abandon his position near Rebecca's coffin. His hands were bloody from clawing through rocks and packed earth, and his clothes were caked with the mud that had accumulated during hours of desperate excavation. Despite his exhaustion, his voice remained steady when he responded to Caldwell's challenge. "Agent Caldwell," Joseph said, carefully keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening while continuing to clear dirt from around the coffin lid. "You're witnessing the rescue of an innocent woman who was buried alive by people claiming to act in the name of justice. Federal law doesn't authorize murder, regardless of what local communities decide about racial boundaries." Caldwell's face flushed with anger at being challenged by an Apache man whose very existence on government property represented violation of federal authority. "Miss Hayes was executed according to territorial law governing criminal activity and moral corruption. Your presence here constitutes interference with legitimate federal operations and provides grounds for immediate arrest." The agent's characterization of Rebecca's murder as legitimate execution revealed the bureaucratic mindset that allowed federal officials to rationalize any action taken against tribal members or their sympathizers. In Caldwell's worldview, his authority superseded moral considerations, and resistance to that authority represented criminal behavior regardless of underlying circumstances. Thunder, meanwhile, had shown no response to Caldwell's commands or drawn weapon. The massive St. Bernard continued digging with single-minded determination, his protective instincts focused entirely on reaching the woman whose distress he could sense through 6 feet of earth. The dog's indifference to federal authority demonstrated a kind of moral clarity that transcended human legal complications. "Your dog needs to be controlled," Caldwell demanded, though his tone suggested uncertainty about how to enforce compliance. "From an animal that outweighed most men and showed no fear of human authority." "Thunder isn't my dog," Joseph replied, never pausing in his own excavation efforts. "He belongs to himself and chooses his own loyalties. Right now, he's chosen to save an innocent life, which makes him more moral than anyone who participated in tonight's ceremony." The direct challenge to federal authority and community judgment infuriated Caldwell, who had built his career on the assumption that Apache individuals would submit to white authority when confronted with superior force. Joseph's continued defiance, combined with his obvious education and articulate English, threatened the racial stereotypes that justified Caldwell's entire approach to Indian management. "You have 10 seconds to abandon this illegal excavation and submit to federal custody," Caldwell announced, cocking his revolver for emphasis. "After that, I'll use whatever force is necessary to prevent further interference with legitimate territorial justice." Inside her coffin, Rebecca had heard every word of the confrontation taking place above her grave. The knowledge that Joseph had risked everything to attempt her rescue filled her with love and gratitude, while Caldwell's threats made clear that their situation had become even more desperate than simple race against time and diminishing oxygen. She began tapping frantically against the coffin lid, trying to signal that they were very close to breaking through, and that abandoning their efforts now would mean certain death for her. The rhythm of her tapping conveyed urgency that reached both Joseph and Thunder, spurring them to even greater efforts despite the federal agent's threats. "I can hear her," Joseph called to Caldwell, his voice carrying across the cemetery with an intensity that reflected both desperation and determination. "Rebecca is still alive down there, and we're close enough to save her. You can arrest me after we get her out, but I won't abandon her to die because you're afraid of losing authority over people you've never understood." The personal nature of Joseph's challenge struck at Caldwell's deepest insecurities about his effectiveness as an Indian agent. His authority had always depended on maintaining psychological dominance over tribal members through threats and punishment, but Joseph's willingness to risk death for love revealed the limitations of fear-based control when confronted with stronger motivations. "Last warning," Caldwell shouted, raising his weapon toward Joseph's head. "Abandon this excavation immediately, or face the consequences of defying federal authority." Thunder chose that moment to break through the final barrier of dirt and debris that separated them from Rebecca's coffin. His massive paws struck wood with a hollow thump that echoed through the night air, confirming that they had reached their goal despite every obstacle that law and community hatred had placed in their path. The sound galvanized Joseph into action that ignored Caldwell's threats entirely. He threw himself into the hole Thunder had created, using his hands and a borrowed shovel to clear the remaining earth from around the coffin lid. The metal latches that Morrison had used to secure Rebecca's tomb were visible now, requiring only minutes of work to open. "Stop or I'll shoot!" Caldwell screamed, his voice breaking with the rage of someone whose authority had been completely undermined by the moral courage of people he had been taught to consider inferior. But Joseph had moved beyond fear of death or federal punishment. Rebecca's survival depended on the next few minutes of work, and no threat was sufficient to make him abandon her when salvation was within reach. His fingers found the first metal latch and began working it free from the wood that held it in. In place, Thunder, sensing that the crisis was approaching its climax, positioned himself between Joseph and Caldwell in a protective stance that made clear his willingness to defend the rescue operation against any interference. The dog's massive size and obvious determination gave even an armed federal agent pause, creating the crucial seconds needed for Joseph to continue his work. The first latch came free with a metallic snap that seemed to echo through the cemetery. Joseph immediately moved to the second latch, his hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, but never faltering in their purpose. Inside the coffin, Rebecca heard the sounds of her salvation approaching and gathered what remained of her strength for the effort of climbing out of her tomb. "Federal crime in progress," Caldwell shouted, though his voice now carried desperation rather than authority. "This Apache savage is interfering with territorial justice and must be stopped before he compromises legitimate government operations." But his appeals to law and order fell on deaf ears in the empty cemetery. The only witnesses to the confrontation were the stars overhead and the graves of people who had lived and died without ever facing the choice between legal compliance and moral necessity that now defined the struggle taking place above Rebecca's tomb. The second latch yielded to Joseph's determined efforts, freeing half of the coffin lid and allowing the first fresh air to reach Rebecca in hours. She gasped with relief as oxygen flowed through the opening, providing the strength she needed for the final effort of escaping her wooden prison. "Joseph," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of shallow breathing. "I knew you would come." The sound of Rebecca's voice, confirming her survival, sent renewed energy through Joseph's exhausted body. He attacked the third latch with desperate intensity, knowing that Caldwell's patience was nearly exhausted and that federal intervention might still doom their rescue attempt. Thunder maintained his protective position, his deep growl serving as warning to anyone who might threaten the final moments of Rebecca's liberation. The dog's loyalty had transcended every boundary that human hatred had tried to establish, proving that some bonds were stronger than law, prejudice, or the temporary madness that had seized a supposedly civilized community. As the third latch came free and the coffin lid began to swing open, revealing Rebecca's pale but determined face in the lantern light, the confrontation in Millfield Cemetery was about to reach its climax. Three forces were converging in a moment that would determine not only Rebecca's survival, but the future of everyone involved in the night's dramatic events. Love had brought Joseph and Thunder to challenge impossible odds. Federal authority had brought Caldwell to defend a system that valued racial control over human life, and courage had sustained Rebecca through an ordeal that would have broken lesser spirits. The outcome of their conflict would depend on which force proved strongest. When civilization's mask finally slipped away and revealed the true character of everyone involved in the struggle between justice and law, love and hatred, hope and despair that was being fought 6 feet underground in an Arizona cemetery, the coffin lid swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the entire cemetery, revealing Rebecca's face illuminated by Caldwell's lantern. Light, pale but alert, her green eyes reflecting both relief and determination as she struggled to sit up in the narrow wooden space that had nearly become her tomb. Joseph immediately reached down to help her, his strong hands gripping her arms as she fought against the weakness that hours of oxygen deprivation had created in her muscles. "Can you climb out?" Joseph asked urgently, acutely aware that Caldwell's patience had reached its breaking point and that their window for escape was measured in seconds rather than minutes. "Yes," Rebecca replied, though her voice was weaker than her will. "Help me up." Thunder maintained his protective stance between the rescue and Agent Caldwell, the massive St. Bernard's deep growl serving as a constant reminder that federal authority would have to go through 200 pounds of determined canine loyalty to stop Rebecca's liberation. The dog's courage had created the crucial breathing room that allowed Joseph to focus on Rebecca's physical needs rather than immediate defense against armed intervention. Rebecca's emergence from the coffin required careful coordination between her depleted strength and Joseph's supportive efforts. Hours of confinement in the narrow space had left her legs cramped and unsteady, while the psychological trauma of live burial had created a desperate urgency to escape the wooden box that had nearly become her permanent tomb. Each movement sent pins and needles through limbs that had been compressed too long in an unnatural position. "Slowly," Joseph coached, supporting her weight as she maneuvered her legs over the edge of the coffin. "We have time to do this safely." But Caldwell's increasing agitation made clear that their time was actually running out faster than Joseph was willing to acknowledge. The federal agent had been forced to watch his authority completely undermined by an Apache man and a dog, and his rage was building toward an explosion that would soon overwhelm his remaining self-control. "This ends now," Caldwell screamed, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the kind of fury that preceded violence. "I'm placing all of you under federal arrest for interference with territorial law enforcement and violation of Indian reservation boundaries." Joseph helped Rebecca to her feet in the bottom of the excavated grave, noting with relief that she could stand independently despite her obvious weakness. Her white burial gown was stained with dirt and torn in several places, but her spirit remained unbroken by the ordeal that would have destroyed lesser individuals. "Rebecca," Joseph said quietly, "we need to get you out of this hole and away from here before Caldwell decides to use that gun." She nodded, understanding that their successful rescue would mean nothing if they couldn't escape before federal intervention trapped them in the cemetery. Her survival had been only the first step in a larger challenge that would require strength, courage, and considerable luck to overcome. The climb out of the 6-foot grave presented significant challenges for someone in Rebecca's weakened condition. Joseph went first, positioning himself to pull her up, while Thunder remained on guard duty, but the earthen walls were unstable and the physical demands were substantial for someone who had spent hours struggling against suffocation. "I've got you," Joseph assured her as she gripped his hands and began the difficult ascent. "Trust me and don't look down." Rebecca's trust in Joseph was absolute, built through months of shared danger and deepened by his willingness to risk everything for her rescue. She focused on his steady voice and strong grip rather than the federal agent whose threats were becoming increasingly desperate as his authority continued to crumble before his eyes. Caldwell watched Rebecca's emergence from the grave with growing recognition that his carefully constructed narrative about territorial justice and federal law enforcement was falling apart. A supposedly dead woman was climbing out of her tomb with the assistance of an Apache man whose intelligence and courage contradicted every stereotype that justified the government's Indian policy. "Stop immediately or I will shoot," Caldwell shouted, raising his revolver toward Joseph and Rebecca as they completed their climb to ground level. "This is your final warning before I use deadly force to preserve federal authority." But Thunder had been waiting for exactly this moment. As Caldwell's attention focused on the escaping couple, the massive St. Bernard launched himself across the cemetery in a charge that demonstrated the kind of protective fury that made his breed legendary for courage and loyalty. 200 pounds of determined canine muscle struck the federal agent before he could react, sending both man and weapon tumbling across the grave-strewn ground. The collision between Thunder and Caldwell created the chaos that Joseph and Rebecca needed to begin their escape from the cemetery. Hand in hand, they ran toward the cemetery gate while the federal agent struggled to recover his weapon and his dignity from beneath a dog whose protective instincts had proven stronger than respect for government authority. "Thunder!" Joseph called, whistling the signal that would bring the St. Bernard to follow their retreat. "Come on, boy!" The dog responded immediately, abandoning his position over the fallen federal agent to race after Joseph and Rebecca as they fled through the cemetery gate toward the open desert beyond Millfield's boundaries. Thunder's speed and size made him easily capable of keeping pace with the humans whose lives he had just saved through his extraordinary courage and loyalty. Behind them, Caldwell struggled to his feet while shouting threats and curses that echoed through the night air. His federal authority had been comprehensively defeated by an Apache man, a supposedly dead white woman, and a dog whose moral clarity exceeded that of most government officials. The humiliation would haunt him for the rest of his career, serving as permanent reminder of the limitations of authority when confronted with genuine moral courage. "Federal fugitives!" Caldwell screamed into the darkness as his quarry disappeared beyond the range of his lantern light. "I'll have the territorial militia hunting all of you before dawn." But his threats fell on deaf ears as Joseph, Rebecca, and Thunder put increasing distance between themselves and the scene of their dramatic confrontation with federal law enforcement. Their immediate escape had succeeded, but they all understood that safety would require reaching Apache territory before Caldwell could organize pursuit with superior numbers and firepower. The desert landscape beyond Millfield offered both opportunities and dangers for fugitives attempting to evade federal pursuit. Joseph's Apache training gave him significant advantages in wilderness navigation and survival, while Thunder's size and endurance made him capable of traveling long distances across difficult terrain. Rebecca, however, remained weak from her ordeal and unfamiliar with desert survival techniques that might prove crucial in the days ahead. "How far to the reservation?" Rebecca asked as they paused to rest after putting several miles between themselves and the cemetery. 15 miles across country," Joseph replied, studying the star patterns that provided navigation guidance in the cloudless Arizona night. "But we can't go directly there. Caldwell will expect that route and have federal troops waiting for us." Joseph's strategic thinking reflected both his Apache heritage and his government education in ways that provided survival advantages neither cultural tradition could have offered separately. His knowledge of white military tactics combined with traditional Apache skills in wilderness concealment to create possibilities for evasion that neither pure assimilation nor pure traditionalism could have achieved. "Where will we go instead?" Rebecca asked, trusting Joseph's judgment completely while recognizing her own limitations in their current circumstances. "There's a hidden canyon about 20 miles south where my grandfather used to take me when I was young," Joseph explained. "Water, shelter, and approaches that can be defended by small numbers against larger forces. We can rest there while planning our next moves." The mention of his grandfather reminded Rebecca of the cultural knowledge that Joseph carried alongside. His formal education, generations of Apache wisdom about surviving in harsh landscapes and evading enemies with superior numbers. That traditional knowledge, combined with his understanding of federal law enforcement methods, provided their best hope for staying ahead of the pursuit that would certainly follow. Thunder had been scouting ahead while Joseph and Rebecca planned. Their route, the dog's extraordinary senses alert for any sign of immediate danger. His return to their position with relaxed body language indicated that their immediate area remained secure, though all three understood that Caldwell would soon organize a systematic search that would test every skill they possessed. "We should keep moving," Joseph said, helping Rebecca to her feet and noting her continuing weakness with concern. "Dawn is still several hours away, and darkness provides our best cover for crossing open ground." Rebecca nodded her agreement, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her love for Joseph and gratitude for his rescue had created a determination that transcended physical limitations, while her ordeal in the coffin had revealed capabilities for endurance that would serve her well in the challenges ahead. As they resumed their journey across the desert landscape, with thunder ranging ahead to provide early warning of any threats, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone in less than 24 hours. She had gone from being a respected member of Millfield society to a woman literally buried alive for loving across racial boundaries, then rescued by the same Apache warrior whose affection had triggered her persecution. The journey ahead would test every assumption she had ever held about civilization, survival, and the true meaning of freedom. But as she walked hand in hand with Joseph through the star-filled Arizona night, with Thunder's loyal presence providing security and comfort, Rebecca understood that she had found something worth any sacrifice, a love that transcended every boundary that hatred could establish, and partners whose courage matched her own determination to build a life based on truth rather than the comfortable lies that had nearly cost her everything. Their escape from Millfield was complete, but their real journey together was just beginning. Behind them lay a community that had revealed its true character through attempted murder disguised as righteous judgment. Ahead lay challenges that would test whether love, courage, and loyalty could create a future worth the risks they had taken to defend it. 3 months after her resurrection from the grave, Rebecca stood at the edge of the hidden canyon that had become her home, watching the sunrise paint the Arizona desert in shades of gold and crimson that no Philadelphia morning had ever revealed. The woman who gazed across the vast landscape bore little resemblance to the preacher's daughter who had once distributed stolen medical supplies while dreaming of forbidden love. Desert life had transformed her into something harder and more resilient, with sun-darkened skin and muscles strengthened by the daily challenges of survival in terrain that demanded both physical toughness and mental adaptability. Her hands, once soft from domestic work and careful needlework, now bore the calluses of someone who could build shelters, set snares, and gather medicinal plants with the expertise of a seasoned Apache woman. The elaborate hairstyles that had once marked her status as a respectable frontier lady had given way to practical braids that kept her auburn hair manageable during long days of hunting and foraging. Most remarkably, her eyes had lost the uncertain quality that had characterized her Millfield years, replaced by the confident gaze of someone who had faced death and discovered that survival depended on inner strength rather than social acceptance. The canyon that Joseph's grandfather had shown him decades earlier had indeed provided the perfect refuge from federal pursuit. Its narrow entrance was nearly invisible from the surrounding desert, concealed behind a rock formation that appeared solid from every angle except the specific approach that revealed the hidden passage. Inside, the canyon opened into a natural fortress nearly a mile long and half a mile wide, with towering walls that provided protection from both weather and human enemies. Natural springs bubbled up from underground sources throughout the canyon floor, creating a micro-environment that supported vegetation impossible in the surrounding desert. Cottonwood trees provided shade and building materials, while wild grasses and edible plants grew in abundance near the water sources. Cave systems honeycombed the canyon walls, offering secure shelter that could be defended by small numbers against vastly superior forces. But the canyon's greatest advantage lay in its spiritual significance to Apache people, a sacred place where Joseph's ancestors had conducted ceremonies and sought visions for generations before white settlement made such practices dangerous. The spiritual protection that traditional beliefs attributed to the location had proven remarkably effective against government forces, whose cultural ignorance made them incapable of understanding where Apache people might seek genuine sanctuary. Agent Caldwell had indeed organized the massive manhunt he had threatened, bringing territorial militia and federal troops to scour every known Apache hideout in the region. His search had lasted 6 weeks and involved over 200 soldiers, making it one of the largest military operations in Arizona Territory's recent history. But his efforts had been based on conventional assumptions about where Indians might seek refuge, focusing on documented locations that appeared in government maps and military reports. Joseph's choice of his grandfather's secret sanctuary had placed them beyond the reach of government forces, who lacked both the local knowledge and cultural understanding necessary to locate truly hidden Apache strongholds. The canyon's entrance had been passed by federal patrols multiple times without detection, its concealment so perfect that even careful observation failed to reveal the passage that led to their refuge. The pursuit had been abandoned not only due to lack of results, but because of growing political pressure from territorial officials who questioned whether the enormous expense of hunting 3 fugitives could be justified when more pressing security concerns demanded attention. Caldwell's failure to capture the escapees had damaged his reputation throughout the federal bureaucracy, leading to reassignment to a less prestigious posting in Wyoming, where his authority over Indians would be limited to managing peaceful tribes with no history of successful resistance to government control. The agent's downfall had been particularly severe because his superiors in Washington had begun questioning the entire Arizona operation after reports surfaced about the circumstances surrounding Rebecca's burial. Federal investigators had discovered that Caldwell had participated in what amounted to attempted murder of a white woman, using his official authority to legitimize community vigilante justice. The scandal had threatened to expose systematic corruption throughout the territorial Indian agency, making Caldwell a liability who needed to be removed from any position where his actions could attract further scrutiny. But the most significant transformation had occurred within Millfield itself, where Rebecca's dramatic resurrection had triggered a crisis of conscience that split the community along moral lines that had previously remained hidden beneath the surface of Christian respectability. The discovery that their victim had escaped death through the intervention of the very Apache man they had demonized forced many townspeople to confront uncomfortable questions about the true nature of their civilized behavior. The revelation that Rebecca was not only alive, but thriving in the wilderness with Joseph and Thunder had spread throughout the territory within weeks of their escape, carried by traders, soldiers, and travelers who had encountered Apache individuals willing to share the story of the remarkable rescue. Each retelling had added details about Thunder's extraordinary courage and Joseph's sophisticated planning, creating a legend that challenged every stereotype about Apache intelligence and moral character. Reverend Thomas Hayes had suffered a complete psychological breakdown following his daughter's escape, unable to reconcile his participation in attempted murder with his theological beliefs about Christian love and forgiveness. The man who had once preached confidently about divine grace and moral certainty had been reduced to a broken figure who spent his days staring at the cemetery where he had helped bury his own daughter alive. His congregation had been forced to find new spiritual leadership when their minister proved incapable of conducting services or providing pastoral care to community members who were themselves struggling with guilt about their participation in the burial ceremony. Several families had left Millfield entirely, unable to continue living in a place where they had revealed the worst aspects of their character under pressure from racial hatred disguised as religious duty. The church building itself had become a source of division rather than unity, with some members arguing that it needed to be torn down and rebuilt because it had been contaminated by hosting the meeting that planned Rebecca's execution. Others insisted that the building could be purified through prayer and rededication, but these theological arguments had only deepened the splits within what remained of the congregation. Some community members had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the real motives behind Rebecca's execution and whether their actions had actually represented justice or simply mob violence legitimized through religious ceremony. The fact that a supposedly savage Apache man had demonstrated greater moral courage than their entire Christian community created cognitive dissonance that several families found impossible to resolve without fundamentally re-examining their beliefs about race, civilization, and spiritual truth. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife who had refused Rebecca service during her final days in Millfield, had become one of the most vocal advocates for community repentance and reform. Her transformation had begun when she learned the full details of Thunder's rescue effort, including the dog's willingness to attack a federal agent to protect people he barely knew. "If a dog could recognize Christian duty when I could not," she had confessed during one of the informal community meetings that had replaced regular church services, "then perhaps my understanding of Christ's teachings has been corrupted by pride and hatred that have nothing to do with genuine faith." Her public admission of moral failure had encouraged others to examine their own participation in events that most now recognized as fundamentally evil, despite their religious justification. These conversations had led to practical changes in how Millfield residents interacted with Apache individuals, with several families quietly beginning to provide legitimate aid to reservation families as a form of penance for their previous behavior. Dr. Marcus Webb had left Millfield entirely after word of Rebecca's survival reached surrounding communities, making his continued medical practice impossible in a region where his pseudo-scientific racism had been exposed as fraudulent justification for attempted murder. His departure had left the town without adequate medical care, forcing residents to travel long distances for treatment or rely on traditional remedies that many had previously dismissed as primitive superstition. The loss of medical services had created practical consequences that made community members more receptive to learning from Apache traditional healing practices, breaking down cultural barriers that had previously prevented useful knowledge exchange. Several Millfield women had begun studying medicinal plant use with Apache healers, discovering that generations of desert survival had produced medical knowledge that complemented rather than contradicted modern scientific understanding. Mayor Collins had been voted out of office in a special election called by citizens who blamed his leadership for the crisis that had nearly destroyed their community's reputation throughout the territory. His replacement was John Mitchell, a merchant who had been the only business owner to oppose the burial ceremony and had spent the months since Rebecca's escape working to restore some semblance of moral credibility to Millfield's civic institutions. Mitchell's first official acts had included formal apologies to the Apache Tribal Council and establishment of trade relationships that provided economic benefits to both communities while creating incentives for peaceful coexistence. These practical measures had proven more effective than religious appeals in changing attitudes about racial cooperation. Samuel Morrison, the undertaker whose suggestion had triggered Rebecca's live burial, had found his professional services boycotted by families who could no longer trust someone who had planned such elaborate cruelty while maintaining an appearance of respectful mourning for the dead. His business had collapsed, forcing him to leave Millfield in search of communities where his reputation for ritual murder had not preceded him. The undertaker's downfall had created a shortage of funeral services that forced community members to handle burials themselves, often seeking guidance from Apache individuals whose traditional death rituals emphasized respect for the deceased and support for grieving families. These interactions had revealed the sophistication of Apache spiritual practices, while demonstrating that savage approaches to death often showed greater wisdom and compassion than supposedly civilized alternatives. But the most remarkable transformation had occurred in the relationship between Millfield and the nearby Apache reservation, where Joseph's heroic rescue of Rebecca had begun changing white perceptions about Apache character and capabilities. The story of Thunder's attack on Agent Caldwell had become legendary throughout the territory, inspiring artwork, songs, and stories that celebrated courage transcending racial boundaries. Several community members had quietly begun providing legitimate aid to reservation families, motivated by recognition that their previous assumptions about racial superiority had been dramatically refuted by recent events. These assistance efforts had revealed the extent of Agent Caldwell's corruption, leading to investigations that resulted in improved federal oversight of reservation management and more adequate food and medical supplies for Apache families. The economic cooperation that had developed between Millfield and the reservation had proven beneficial to both communities, with Apache craftspeople finding markets for traditional goods while providing white families with superior tools and knowledge for desert survival. These practical relationships had created personal friendships that transcended racial boundaries and challenged fundamental assumptions about the impossibility of peaceful coexistence. Martha Collins, who had been among the most vocal advocates for Rebecca's execution, had experienced what she described as a spiritual awakening after learning that Thunder, a dog she had often admired during his occasional appearances in town, had been the key to saving Rebecca's life. The realization that an animal had demonstrated greater Christian compassion than she had been capable of showing forced her to re-examine everything she believed about moral hierarchy and spiritual truth. That dog understood God's will better than I did, she had declared during one of the community meetings that had replaced regular church services. If Thunder could recognize the value of that woman's life when I could not, then perhaps my understanding of Christian duty has been corrupted by racial hatred that has nothing to do with genuine faith. Her transformation had included learning Apache language and customs, developing friendships with reservation women that had enriched her understanding of both cultures while providing practical knowledge about desert life that proved invaluable. During the difficult months following Millfield's crisis of conscience, the ripple effects of Rebecca's rescue had thus extended far beyond the immediate drama of her escape, creating changes throughout the region that challenged fundamental assumptions about race, authority, and moral truth that had previously seemed unquestionable to frontier communities. Government officials had been forced to acknowledge that Apache individuals possessed intelligence and moral sophistication that contradicted official policies based on assumptions about primitive savage behavior. In their hidden canyon, Rebecca and Joseph had built a life that combined the best elements of both their cultural traditions while creating something entirely new. Joseph's Apache knowledge of desert survival merged with Rebecca's organizational skills and medical training to create a sustainable existence that proved the possibility of genuine partnership between individuals from supposedly incompatible worlds. Their daily routine reflected this cultural synthesis in practical ways that demonstrated how different traditions could strengthen rather than threaten each other. Morning hours were devoted to hunting and gathering, using Apache techniques that Rebecca had mastered with surprising speed, while afternoons involved medical practice that combined traditional plant medicine with the formal training she had received through her father's ministry to frontier communities. Rebecca had learned to hunt with bow and arrow, track animals across rocky terrain, and identify dozens of desert plants for food and medicine with skill that would have amazed anyone who had known her during her Philadelphia days. But more importantly, she had discovered capabilities for independence and self-reliance that her previous life had never allowed her to develop. The woman who had once depended on her father's authority and community approval for identity and security had become someone whose sense of self derived from internal sources that no external force could threaten or destroy. Joseph, meanwhile, had found in Rebecca a partner whose intellectual curiosity and moral courage matched his own, creating possibilities for personal growth that neither pure Apache tradition nor complete assimilation to white culture could have provided. Their relationship had become a laboratory for exploring how individuals from different backgrounds could create shared meaning without sacrificing essential elements of their separate identities. Their love had been tested by experiences that would have destroyed weaker bonds, but each challenge had revealed additional depths of compatibility and mutual respect that strengthened rather than threatened their commitment to building a life together. The ordeal that had begun with stolen medical supplies and forbidden romance had evolved into something approaching a perfect partnership between equals who had chosen each other despite every obstacle that racial prejudice and institutional authority could create. Thunder had appointed himself guardian of their small community, ranging throughout the canyon to provide early warning of any threats while serving as hunting companion and protector whose loyalty had become legendary among the few Apache visitors who had discovered their refuge. The dog's extraordinary courage and intelligence had made him a figure of almost mythical status in tribal stories that celebrated his role in defeating federal authority through simple moral clarity. The massive St. Bernard's presence had also created an unexpected bridge between Apache traditional beliefs about animal spirits and Rebecca's Christian understanding of divine intervention. Both cultures recognized Thunder's rescue of Rebecca as evidence of spiritual forces working through natural means to protect innocent love from corrupt authority. Their greatest triumph lay not in personal happiness, but in the proof their relationship, provided that the racial boundaries frontier society considered absolute, were actually artificial barriers maintained through ignorance and fear rather than genuine incompatibility between different peoples. Their successful partnership had become living evidence that love, respect, and shared values could transcend every division that hatred had tried to establish as permanent and unchangeable. On this particular morning, as Rebecca watched the sunrise transform their hidden world into a landscape of impossible beauty, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the suffocating darkness of a premature grave to the freedom of a life chosen. Rather than imposed by others' expectations, Joseph emerged from their cave dwelling, carrying the coffee that had become their morning ritual, followed by Thunder, whose massive presence continued to provide both security and companionship in their desert sanctuary. The three companions had become a family united by bonds forged in crisis and strengthened through the daily challenges of creating something meaningful from the ruins of their former lives. "Any regrets?" Joseph asked, settling beside Rebecca on the rocky outcrop that provided panoramic views of their hidden valley. "Only that it took being buried alive to discover who I really was," Rebecca replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "And that so many people had to reveal their worst natures before a few could find their best ones." Thunder positioned himself between them in the way that had become habitual, his great head resting on paws that had once dug through 6 feet of earth to save a woman whose kindness to his adopted family had earned loyalty that transcended every boundary human hatred had tried to establish. "The stories reaching us from Millfield suggest that some good has come from our suffering," Joseph observed, referring to the reports brought by Apache visitors about positive changes in white attitudes toward tribal people. "Perhaps that's how redemption works," Rebecca replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst human behavior creates opportunities for the best human responses to emerge." As the sun climbed higher and began its daily transformation of their canyon refuge, Rebecca understood that she had found something worth every sacrifice she had made to defend it. Her love for Joseph had cost her everything she had once considered important: family, community, security, and social respectability. But it had given her something far more valuable: the freedom to become fully herself in partnership with someone whose courage and character matched her own determination to live according to truth rather than convenience. The grave that had been intended as her final punishment had instead become the birthplace of a new kind of existence, proving that some forms of death were actually resurrection in disguise. Love had indeed demanded the ultimate sacrifice, but what had died was only the illusion that happiness could be found through conformity to expectations that denied essential human dignity and truth. In the growing warmth of the Arizona morning, surrounded by beauty that few civilized people would ever experience, and accompanied by companions whose loyalty had been tested by fire, Rebecca Hayes had found paradise in the very wilderness that her former community considered hell. And she had discovered that freedom, once truly grasped, was worth any price that hatred could demand in payment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.